I'm back. Mr. Clark's back. We're going to go through topic 9.3 this time around. We're going to take a look at organized labor. We're going to see how labor begins to take a look at some of the issues that are ongoing, some of the problems in the factories, some of the rights in terms of wages and conditions and things like that. We're going to assess the impact of some of the big businesses that we had looked at previously. We had looked at the issues in regard to big businesses and their constant expansion, and they looking to, I guess, exploit profit for the betterment of their bottom dollar. We'll look at the very first labor unions and some of the strikes. You did do a outside reading that kind of reinforced some of the major issues in regard to work stoppage and different actions that unions took. All right, so as we go through the questions, once again, you should be double checking your answers on your Google document. You had filled them out previously. So when you take a look at your responses, you don't need to rewrite your answers or delete them and put what I have exactly down here. Just make sure you have something similar. If you have gaps or blanks or things that you really need to add to, feel free to add to your responses. We're moving towards the goal of having a assessment, quiz or a test on this material that we'll probably have sometime after spring break. All right, so we look at the tension between business owners and workers. This is kind of brewing underneath the surface. Over the course of time, workers are going to lose some patience with the jobs. They're going to see that there's better options out there, and they perhaps might want to get a little bit better pay, especially when they're dealing with a lot of the conditions that were less than safe in the factories. There was really no job security during this period of time, really no benefits. Today, we kind of look at benefits in some lines of work. You get health insurance as part of your compensation for working. Other jobs put money into a retirement account, a 401k. They kind of match maybe your contributions, or you might have a pension plan, things like that. As industry expanded during this period of time, we were kind of developing the haves and the have-nots in the United States. Obviously, those who were the business owners were really making a tremendous amount of money and great wealth during that period of time. Those tended to be the owners of the factories, the people who were the inventors during the period of time. If you owned a mine or a railroad, you could be a profitable and wealthy individual. And not so much your small-scale farmers, but more so your commercialized farmers. Those were the big plantations who were growing cash crops, like cotton, for example. Now, the Industrial Revolution in general was seeing a number of positive benefits for society. As a result of the industrial expansion during this period of time in the late 1800s, we saw a higher standard of living for citizens. And when you look at standard of living, that means their living conditions, their housing, their access to health care, the average amount of money they have, the infant mortality rate. More and more babies were living beyond the age of 1. This is a sign of the improvements in medicine. More and more goods and products were available. People were beginning to shop for the first time at stores. There was increased access to public institutions, like, for example, museums for cultural enjoyment and education in schools, although still during this period of time, the vast majority of people, age 15 and older, were definitely working during that period of time. And many teenagers, even younger than the age of 15, would be working. Something that's still an issue in modern day society. There are factories that are called sweatshops. These were factories with really, really poor conditions, very, very low pay, long hours. They picked up the nickname of a sweatshop because when you would work there, in particular in the summer months, they were really small, hot, dirty, and poorly ventilated and poorly lit. Very dangerous conditions during that period of time. Some were dangerously noisy or required poorly trained workers to run dangerous machines. All right, so when you're looking at the issues here with the sweatshop, some were dealing with poorly trained workers. When you had a poorly trained worker, obviously that's a situation where mistakes can happen. You also have to think about, too, if you're working 10 or 12 hours, it goes to a situation where you make mistakes, you hit the wrong button, you get your hand or one of the more traumatic injuries, especially for obviously women. Their hair would get caught in the machinery, and then their hair would kind of get wrapped into the equipment. Someone ended up getting scalped, meaning the hair got ripped right off their head. So really a very dangerous period of time. So we look at 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. That's 72 hours a week. Obviously, the normal work week nowadays is 40. Unfortunately, during this period of time of the pandemic, work week is less than that for the average worker, with a lot of people being forced to stay home or work from home. If you look here at this little drawing, that's kind of an example of a sweatshop. You can see people working constantly, not very happy faces there. And we see somebody getting injured on a job. Nowadays, if you get injured on a job, you will receive workman's compensation. You would get paid until you were able to go back to work. Back then, you were fired with no compensation. As industrialization advanced, more jobs became open to women. Women tended to work in areas such as a laundromat, as laundresses, telegraph operators, and typists. And generally speaking, most women worked in factories. Photograph there portrays a woman working on a sewing machine in a shoe factory in the late 19th century. So when we think about children, why did many children hold factory jobs at the end of the 1800s? How did working at young ages impact these young children? Well, working parents brought their children to work so that the youngsters would not be left at home unattended. Moreover, many parents earned such low wages that children needed to earn money in order to help the family to survive. Child workers suffered physically and mentally from poor working conditions and long hours. By the 1800s, nearly 1 in 5 children between the ages of 10 and 16 worked rather than attending school. So when you think about a difficult situation during this current situation in American history with the issues surrounding the pandemic, obviously it's difficult for everyone, but when you think about some of the challenges that young children went through during that period of time in the late 1800s, fortunately this will be hopefully just a short period of time in American history and things will go back to normal. But this is pretty much, the status quo and the normal way for children for this period of time in history. Okay, what were the benefits of company towns and company stores to the businesses that ran them? Okay, so we have a couple of visuals down the bottom here as I discuss company towns. The bottom left one is an overview of a company town. You can see everything kind of built very close together. On the right side is a company town and a drawing of it. So company towns were usually in remote areas where land was inexpensive. And as a result, there wasn't a lot of housing that was just naturally there. So workers were housed near the factory. You can see they built housing structures, almost looking like dorms. Companies then ran the housing units and they profited again off of the rent the workers paid. Companies opened up company stores. There they would be able to control pricing and generate additional revenue. So it was a whole systematic approach to profit for the company towns themselves. Often workers bought items on credit at high rates of interest and could be arrested if they left their jobs before their debt was fully repaid. So in some ways, the company towns tied the workers to the company town themselves. They really couldn't leave until they had paid off all their debt. And some of them made such low wages that it almost seemed as if they would never pay that debt off. So as a result, many workers were forced to stay against their will at their jobs. The growth of labor unions during this period of time, as business owners' profits skyrocketed, many of the workers looked at themselves and said, why are we being left behind? They became very frustrated that their wages did not earn them enough to buy many of these consumer goods that they were producing. Even when they were becoming more and more affordable, some of their wages were just so low that they really barely had enough money to pay for their bare necessities, no less a luxury item. They also resented working in unsafe conditions in some cases. The unsafe conditions would ruin their health before they even were very old. Increasingly, workers began organizing to take their complaints about wages and working conditions and hours to their employers. This is where we're going to see the expansion of union membership. Workers who wanted positive changes, they had a couple different approaches they can take. One would be through the collective bargaining process. This is the process in which employees and employers negotiate back and forth. Employees make a series of demands like hours, wages, and working conditions. And then the employers will make an offer back as to what they'd be willing to accommodate. Let's say you're making 20 cents an hour, you want to make 40 cents an hour. Maybe the employers will offer 30 cents an hour and you kind of settle on that. Maybe you're working 72 hours a week and you request to work 60 hours a week, and maybe you end up working, after you negotiate, 65 hours a week. Those are some of the things they did. If collective bargaining process failed, the next step for workers would be to go on to a strike. This was designed to hurt the profit margin of the factory owners. Workers would refuse to work until their demands were met. Most strikes tended to be local. Sometimes they involve workers in entire industries across the state, a region, or sometimes even a country. In the 1830s, a movement called socialism began to spread throughout Europe. And how does a socialist society function? What is the goal of a socialist society? So this became the alternative in some countries across the world. So when we look at socialism, I apologize for the scroll back here. So socialism is the economic and political philosophy, and this is question number 11, that favors public instead of private control of property and income. Socialists believe that society at large, not just the private individuals, should take charge of a nation's wealth during a period of time. That wealth, they argue, should be distributed equally to everyone. So basically the idea of socialism, instead of the capitalistic society that we have here in the United States, where those who open up the businesses make the profit, profits should then be shared in a socialist society by the individuals who help to produce that wealth. In 1848, the German philosopher Karl Marx, hopefully somebody you heard of based on your studies in world history, he wrote the book The Communist Manifesto. It denounced communism and predicted a working class revolution. His 1848 book indicated that the working class would eventually rise up against the ownership class, the entrepreneurs, the business owners, the Carnegies, the Rockefellers, the people we had discussed previously. They would then take over the factories and the means of production, and then everybody would share then equally within society. It would end the free enterprise system and the private property and individual entrepreneurs. Today, the modern Democratic Party, the most liberal wing of their party, would be the kind of the socialist ideas that Bernie Sanders' campaign has been kind of built on in his two presidential runs in 2016 and 2020. The preamble to the Knights of Labor's Constitution, there's a little excerpt there that I'll read for you. The recent alarming development and aggression of aggregated wealth, which unless checked, will inevitably lead to the pauperization and hopeless degradation of toiling masses, meaning that people will continue to toil or work nonstop just for the profit margin of the big business owners. It would render it imperative if we desire to enjoy the blessings of life that a check should be placed upon the power of kind of this big wealthy class, and a system adopted will secure the laborer the fruits of his toil, meaning the laborer, meaning the average worker, would enjoy the fruits of his hard labor. So these were negative words: hopeless, degradation, fear, indignation. Some of the positive words that they were hoping to kind of change around, the blessings and fruits of the toil. When we think about union membership, probably the foremost, kind of the George Washington of the labor union movement will be Samuel Gompers. He was a poor Jewish immigrant from England who had worked his way up to head the Cigar Makers Union in New York State. In 1886, he helped to found the most impactful union, probably in the history of our country, the AFL, the American Federation of Labor. He served as the president of this labor union for 40 years. He stated, and you see the quote, "The trade union movement represents the organized economic power of workers. It is in reality the most potent and the most direct social insurance the workers can establish." So he's a strong advocate for workers. So when you look at some of the earliest unions during this period of time, how were the goals and actions of the Knights of Labor similar to the AFL? And how are they different? So both organizations were labor unions designed to advance worker rights through collective bargaining. However, the Knights of Labor was open to all workers, both skilled and unskilled workers, regardless of gender or race, whereas the AFL had limited membership, white males who were skilled workers. Additionally, the Knights of Labor worked for sweeping social changes, whereas the AFL focused on bread and butter issues such as wages and hours. Next, we'll look at some of the early protest movements. The first major strike occurred in the railroad industry in 1877. Striking workers were responding to wage cuts, caused massive property damage and destruction in several cities. State militias had to be called in to protect strike breakers, those who were going to work to try and get around the strikers. Temporary workers are strike breakers. They have a nickname called a scab, is a person who breaks a strike. Eventually, the federal government will be sent in to restore order. You can see a factory on fire here and kind of the violent activities ongoing here on the right side. '17, why did public opinion begin to turn against unions after the Haymarket demonstration in Illinois and the Homestead strike in Pennsylvania? And so in both cases, Americans watched in horror as violence broke out. People were killed. Nobody wants to see anybody die in a labor protest, so it got a little bit to the extreme. In the Haymarket demonstration, an anarchist threw a bomb, sparking a riot. Dozens of people, including police officers, lost their lives. In the Homestead strike against Carnegie Steel, Andrew Carnegie's partner, Henry Frick, hired a private police force and wounded several of the striking workers. So they're basically using their own hired guns basically to kind of break up the strikers. In retaliation, anarchists tried to assassinate Frick. Though in both cases, the anarchists acted on their own, the public began to associate unions with disorder, lawlessness, violence, and chaos. Here you can see some of the violent activities. You see the police in there. You see the gunfire going back and forth. So really a chaotic situation. Okay, another big strike during this period of time is the Pullman strike. The Pullman strike was warranted because the Pullman company was engaging in wage slavery, meaning the wages were so low that it was almost at the standard of slavery. The company forced workers to live in a company town, and rents at the company town were out of proportion with the reduced wages the workers received. And so that led to violent actions and a strike. 19, what argument did the railroads use in court to persuade the government to end the Pullman workers' strike? The railroads argued that the strike violated the Sherman Antitrust Act because the strike restrained free trade by preventing the railroads from continuing their operations. The outcome of the Pullman strike greatly impacted trade unions over the next few decades. It set an important trend. Employers routinely appealed to the court to order unions to stop striking, citing laws like the Sherman Antitrust Act. So sometimes, because the powerful business owners had more money, they had better attorneys, They were able to kind of twist around American existing laws in the benefit of the business owner and at the expense of the striking workers. Courts usually supported these appeals, denying unions a legally protected status, thus eroding any gains that unions would make. '21, who was Eugene Debs? What did he do? He was also a union leader, and by the end of the 1800s, Debs had developed his political philosophy that was very similar to some of the socialist ideas we had looked at previously. He actually organized the American Socialist Party in 1897, and he ran for the presidency as a socialist candidate more than one time, including in 1900. In 1905, he founded the Industrial Workers of the World, IWW, or Wobblies as they were nicknamed. And Debs stated, in every age has been the tyrant, the oppressor, and the exploiter who has wrapped himself in the cloak of patriotism or religion, or in some cases both, to deceive and overrule the people. You're looking at the visual there. The four major unions during this period of time was the National Trade Union, established in 1834. This is open to all workers in all trades. The Knights of Labor in 1869, which sought the general ideology of reform, open to workers of all trades. The AFL, established in 1886, focused on specific workers' issues, the organization of skilled workers from local craft unions. And then the American Railway Union in 1893, the first industrial union open to all railway workers. All right, so when we look at the impact and legacy of the labor movement in the late 1800s and early 1900s, some of the key things they developed were the rights to collective bargaining and strikes, passed legislation that would become the way of life for American industry, and no longer would workers simply accept bad policies without making their voices heard. Hopefully you enjoyed 9.3 and our discussion here on the labor movement. Make sure you've double-checked your answers to 9.3, and we'll move on next to 9.4. Mr. Clark is out.